Good morning, Truth Seekers. Welcome back. I am so excited to have a guest today who went viral, I suspect on accident, when he wrote an article called Not a Daycare. He is the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, the author of several books, and one of the few sane people left on planet Earth. His new book, Not a Daycare, is out right now. It came out a few months ago, and I'm very excited to have him on the show to talk about the current sad state of affairs on college campuses. Dr. Piper, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm honored to join you guys. Thank you for having me on.
So I suspect you didn't mean to be a cultural warrior, or was this your intent from the beginning, to go viral and get the message out there and really stick a dagger in the current state of affairs for the cause?
Well, I actually had a couple critics at the front end of this viral piece accuse me of manipulating it for marketing purposes. And I thought at the time, if I were that good, if I could actually create that type of viral activity, I'd be a very wealthy man. So no, it was not intentional. And if I could do it over again, I would, but I don't know how to recreate that type of viral activity.
So tell me about for people who are not familiar with you or what happened, kind of give us the genesis of what happened, how it resulted in the book, and what's happened since. It's been almost 6 months since the book came out, and that's what I'm most curious about is what's the fallout, what are the next steps, and what do you do next to follow up on this fantastic book that you wrote?
All right, so the context of the story is this. It was about 2 years ago during Thanksgiving week here at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. And Oklahoma Wesleyan is a bold and unapologetic Christian institution. You can't come to my school without knowing that we stand for the primacy of Christ, the priority of Scripture, the pursuit of truth, and the practice of wisdom. Those are our missional cornerstones. And you don't enroll here without knowing that. But in spite of that clarity, during a chapel service during Thanksgiving week, where the homily was on 1 Corinthians 13, and for those that don't know, that's the quintessential love chapter of the Bible. Love is patient, love is kind. We had a homily, a chapel service on 1 Corinthians 13. And one of our students was actually offended by it. He approached the speaker afterwards and said, "You singled me out. You made me feel uncomfortable." I was incredulous when I heard this. So I wrote an article for the local newspaper, likewise for our website, and I said basically this: if you expect us to coddle you rather than confront you, if you expect us to make you feel comfortable rather than challenge your character, this is the wrong university for you. I'm not going to issue trigger warnings before altar calls, and I'm not going to sit around and consider the fact that we're sharing 1 Corinthians 13 to be a microaggression. That's ridiculous. This is a university. It's not a daycare. And when I said that, it went viral. We had 3.5 million people read that piece within a 2-week period of time. That led to my book, which you're referring to, which is titled Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. It's been quite a ride, actually.
And they are devastating. I'm almost not sure where to start. You give so many great examples. I think I want to talk more about the philosophical idea of what happens when we remove time-tested ideas, or you might have to correct me, what G.K. Chesterton called chronological, I've got it written down here somewhere. Help me.
Snobbery?
Chronological snobbery. I encounter this every single day. Let's talk about the effect that's had on the university.
Actually, that's a quote from Lewis as much as it is Chesterton.
Okay.
C.S. Lewis was very critical and actually hit one of his friends, Owen Barfield, actually put him on to the very concept of chronological snobbery. And he was actually challenging Lewis when Lewis was an agnostic and an atheist, and suggesting that Lewis's intellectual arrogance and being so confident in his modern ideas might be something that he would want to reassess, because the time-tested truths are there for a reason. They're good ideas. Those ideas have endured the test of time because they work. They're real. They're grounded in truth, not your transient opinions. And Lewis recognized that, and then he started commenting on chronological snobbery, which is really probably one of the greatest challenges of our era, of our time, and maybe every era, every time. We're so smart, we're so good, we're so bright that we think we know more than everybody else that preceded us. We know more than Lewis, we know more than Chesterton, we know more than Jefferson, we know more than Davis, we know more than Adams, we know more than Moses, and we know more than Paul. And frankly, even when it comes to the words of Jesus, we seem to want to deconstruct those and then reconstruct them in an image that we find acceptable. Frankly, what we do, it's narcissist. We end up worshiping the God we see in the mirror more than the one we find in the Bible, and that never ends well.
So I'd like to shock people into going out and getting your book, because I think it's a must read. One of the ones that I wasn't that familiar with, the incidents, and I may be pronouncing it wrong, is it Thomas Clock or Thomas Cloquet? I'm not really sure how to pronounce it.
I believe it's Clock.
Clock went to the University of Texas, Arlington, and he was accused of harassing another student and being homophobic. Tell us the rest of the story.
Well, as you know, and I believe you're referring to this story, because he was accused of being homophobic, he became harassed. Is this the young man that ended up committing suicide?
Yeah, that's the
All right.
denouement.
I wanted to make sure I was on the right story here because there are several in my book. He was accused of being homophobic because he disagreed with homosexual activity. He wasn't belittling individuals. He wasn't belittling another human being. He was simply saying, I think there are certain behaviors and actions and activities that are moral, and there are some that aren't. As a result of that, he was accused of being homophobic, and he was harassed to such an extent that he actually became so distraught that he ended up taking his own life. So under the banner of tolerance, people became so intolerant of him. Under the banner of love, people became so hateful of him that they actually pushed this young man into a state of total devastation to the point where he took his own life. This is the lunacy of the left. We saw off the very branch upon which we sit. We say stuff like this: I can't tolerate his intolerance. I hate those hateful people. I'm sure that nothing is sure. I know that nothing can be known. I'm absolutely confident there are no absolutes. And as the result of it, we saw off the branch upon which we sit, and our freedoms and our culture comes tumbling down. And his suicide is a perfect example of it.
As I was reading that, it was last week when I came across that particular instance. And then I don't know if you read yesterday, there was a porn star who actually committed suicide because she felt it was unsafe for her to be engaged with someone who had done male-on-male gay porn. And then you've got this whole issue with the Christian Baker and the discussion around freedom of association. And I was going to say exactly what you said. The pendulum of tolerance has swung so far that we're now at the point of insanity, where the definition has been lost, which I really think is one of the themes of your book, is defining truth objectively and subjectively. What's another example that would give someone pause about sending their kids to just any random university?
Well, let me comment on this tolerance issue, and you can get me off this kick in a second if you want. But I was on the O'Reilly Factor, and we were discussing religious freedom. And it was during the Indiana RFRA debate where Indiana was proposing that it have a religious freedom amendment, and the left went ballistic and said, no, you can't have that. Well, I was on the O'Reilly Factor, and we were debating that. And I finally looked at Mr. O'Reilly, and I said, on this issue of tolerance, Mr. O'Reilly, did you send your wife an I tolerate you card on your anniversary? And there was a pause. And I said, I would suggest you probably didn't, because it wouldn't have ended well. Because tolerance is an inferior virtue. Tolerance says, I don't care about you. I don't love you. Do what you want. Whereas love, Christian charity, says, I care deeply about you. Stop. Love is a superior virtue. Tolerance is an inferior virtue. We don't send our spouses I tolerate you cards on our anniversary because we recognize that tolerance says I don't care and love says I care deeply. And that's the antithesis. That is, well, not the antithesis. That is the crux of the issue when it comes to our cultural debate right now. Do we worship at the altar of tolerance, or do we actually think we ought to love people enough to confront, to challenge, to embolden them to do what's right?
Judge, don't say it too loud.
Thank you. I mean, one of the most misused Bible verses of our time is thou shalt not judge. Well, of course, yes, Jesus did tell us not to judge, but the very next sentence is this: by their fruit you shall know them. So he's not telling you not to judge. He's telling you that you will be measured by the same standard that you use to judge others. Okay? It's not an admonition to not judge. It's an admonition to be a man of integrity, so that when you do judge, the same measuring rod that you're using to find fault in others cannot be used against you to find the same errors and faults within yourself.
If I can, I'm actually working on a book called Judge Early, Judge Often, but I've got a first book I got to write called So You're a Procrastinator. So they're both in the process. But no, I've said that several times. I go, if what he's saying is true, your interpretation is true, then I would impart that it's the most important thing you can focus on getting good at, right? There's nothing more important than figure out what standard you want to be judged by, so get proficient at it. And that's by judging righteously before you feign to judge anyone else. Judge yourself first. That's how I interpret it. But
absolutely. And those that tell us not to judge are judging us for judging. So that makes them guilty of the very same thing that they're accusing us of doing. You can't tell somebody that you're offended by their judgmental spirit without judging them for having a judgmental spirit. And therefore, you're guilty of the exact same thing you're accusing them of committing. Again, they're sawing off the branch upon which they sit. It's a self-refuting claim to say that you shouldn't judge me.
It's a vicious circle. I found it interesting that you quoted Nietzsche, I think in chapter 3, when he said that you can judge a man's spirit by the amount of truth he can tolerate. And this begs the bigger question about the fact that I wrote an article years ago about how the Ivy Leagues were started by evangelist Christians who wanted to open up institutions of higher truth, light, and knowledge, and how that's been completely hijacked and the history of that's been forgotten. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of the institution of higher learning as a place to discover truth versus what it basically does now.
Okay. My first book, before I wrote Not a Daycare, my first book is titled Why I'm a Liberal and Other Conservative Ideas. I'll say that again. Why I'm a Liberal and Other Conservative Ideas. Now, what's my point? As an unapologetic conservative, I believe in conserving things. Yes, I believe in conserving clean water, clean air, an owl, a tree, and a whale. I believe in conserving those things. But I also believe, as a conservative, in conserving the time-tested truths of God, those self-evident truths that have been endowed to us by our Creator that give us the greatest measure of human freedom ever in the course of human history. So, as a conservative, why am I saying I'm a liberal? It's because classical liberalism stood for liberty and liberation and freedom and justice. A liberal arts institution, to get to your question, a liberal arts institution was designed to do what? Let's go back to Oxford some 1,000 years ago. It was designed to educate a free man and a free woman, a free culture, a free society. It was an education in liberty, thus the word liberal. Harvard and Dartmouth and Princeton and Yale and all of the Ivy League, except one, were founded in the context of the words of Christ. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It was the context of truth that gave us the ability to pursue human liberty and human flourishing. A classical liberal arts education is an education that's grounded in the words of Jesus: truth, freedom, liberty, liberation, freedom, and justice. And like Chesterton told us, now let's go back to Chesterton. If you want to have freedom, you better build a fence. It's the paradox of discipline and freedom. That if you want the grandest playground in the world for your children to play on, you better build a fence around it. Otherwise, what will they do? They will get scared and huddle up in the center because they don't know where the boundaries are, and therefore they won't enjoy the full playground. Or you'll start policing them and yelling at them and haranguing them and telling them, stay away from the edges, come over here. Or finally, they might run off into the road and get killed because there was nothing to protect them from the dangers. There's the paradox of discipline and freedom. Freedom does not presuppose a free-for-all. Freedom presupposes the measuring rod of truth so that you can do some measuring. C.S. Lewis said, you can do no measuring without a measuring rod outside of those things being measured. That's the context for truth, and that's the context for freedom.
Speaking of protection and ideas, in chapter 6, I think it was probably my favorite chapter because you talk about ideas having consequences. And when you look at the state of affairs on the college campus, you say, how did we get here? What ideas led to this being the culture that we're fostering? So when we criticize millennials, I have to look back and say, well, they didn't start out this way, right? They were taught to be this way, nature versus nurture. And so you give an example about a gentleman named Abdul Arten, I believe, who actually mowed down people on campus at Ohio State and then got out of his car and started stabbing them. And you talk about what the university's reaction to this was, and I had long forgotten what went down. But do you recall this story?
Well, the university's reaction was to start blaming the victims rather than to deal with the bad ideas and the bad worldview of the guy that perpetuated the act in the first place. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, it was inviting Nathan Lane to the university, which I don't recall that I had read at the time. Go ahead.
No, it's crazy. Here's what we have. Richard Weaver told us in 1948, and I say this in this book, and I say it elsewhere in this chapter as well, in other chapters throughout the book. You go back to Richard Weaver's seminal work in 1948, which was titled Ideas Have Consequences, and you ask this question. What was his point? Ideas have consequences. You hardly even need to read the rest of Weaver's book to understand what he's saying, that good ideas breed good culture, good community, good government, good kids, good churches, good corporations, and bad ideas will breed the opposite. No idea lies fallow. All worldviews, all ideas have consequences. Now, why is 1948 pertinent in this anecdote? It's because Weaver was writing just a handful of years after what? World War II.
Right.
He recognized that the Germans should have seen this coming. It was as predictable as the sunrise. The crazy ideas and the lousy ideas that they were consuming in the academy and in their culture were going to bear fruit, and they indeed did bear fruit. Hitler said, let me control the textbooks and I will control the state. And Weaver was recognizing and telling everybody that the ideas that we've imbibed as a people bore themselves out in the terrible consequences of the Holocaust. It's a lesson that we need to learn. If we fail to confront bad ideas, and how do you confront them? With the measuring rod of truth. You will always bear negative consequences in your culture and in your kids and in your community.
Yeah, the Nathan Lane story, he talked about how they brought this gentleman on to talk about how Islamophobia was basically a structured creation of right-wing fear and fear-mongering. And that gentleman actually, the guy who ran him down, Abdul, had a paper due that week on microaggression. And you made a really good point about what that kind of thinking does to a person's mind. But speaking of World War II, I just saw Polar Express for the first time with my kids this year at a Christmas party. Never seen it. You talk about having a tradition of watching it every single year. And you actually make a fascinating comparison in your book. You compare the train in Polar Express, which Tom Hanks said, you got to get on the train, to the train in Steven Spielberg's I've forgotten the name of the movie, Schindler's List, to let us know that all trains are not created equal, and moral relativism is a surefire way to destruction. Expound on that idea a little bit and how it affects the millennial mind and the college university.
All right, the two trains. I tell the story about the Polar Express. It's a beautiful Christmas story, but the interesting thing, at the end of the story, after the kids have gone to the North Pole and returned, Tom Hanks, the main character in the movie, along with the little boy that was on a magical Christmas Eve train ride, Tom Hanks ushers him off the train as he drops him off at his house at the end of the movie, and he says this, looks at the little boy, and he says, the thing about trains is this. It doesn't matter where they're going. What matters is just deciding to get on one. Now, that sounds all grand and good, doesn't it? That sounds like a wonderful moral to the story. But let's think about this. Now let's go from this 3D animated movie to a real story. The trains that are chugging across the snow-laden fields and hills of Germany. Those trains are pulling boxcars. Those boxcars are filled with Jews, and those trains are bound for where? Auschwitz and Dachau. Now, who among us is going to look those Jews in the eye, like Tom Hanks did, and say, the thing about trains is this. It doesn't matter where they're going. What matters is just getting on the train. Any train, enjoy the journey. Well, of course, the destination matters, and of course, the train matters. Therefore, we need to apply this same anecdote, the same analogy, if you will, to the ideas that we get on, those ideas that we ride within culture. Some of them will take us to Auschwitz, and some of us will take us to the grand and beautiful and the glorious and the true. I would argue we might want to start teaching our kids which ideas are which, and which trains lead to good places and which trains might lead to bad places in our educational system.
One of the first interviews I ever did was with Andy Andrews, who wrote that book, How to Kill 11 Million People. And he would probably argue that Tom Hanks had a harder time persuading that boy to get on his train than the German leaders in the ghetto did to get the Jews on the original trains, because they promised them that they would lead to their salvation. And it all started with deluding them into believing a lie and coddling them into a false sense of security. And I want to talk more about the university. Let's go with the CCCU. This is something I didn't know about that you withdrew from this organization. And I want to have a discussion with you about the nature of what it means to be an evangelical, what it means to be part of Christendom. And because as we talked about earlier with judging, you look at Christ and those ideals and the kind of life that would lead us to if we would follow it, the kind of person we would be, the judgment we would espouse, the way we would treat our spouse and our loved ones, and the way we behave in public. And as you watch cultural or iconic monoliths in society crumble, you see a lack of those values. So I'd like to personalize that to you and talk about your withdrawing from the CCCU and how that happened.
The Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, the CCCU, is an umbrella organization that represents some 120 institutions that claim to be Christ-affirming, Christ-centered educational institutions, evangelical Christian colleges by and large. Why did we withdraw? Well, it was right after Obergefell. The Obergefell decision came down, and two member institutions, Eastern Mennonite and Goshen College, announced immediately that they would start hiring married homosexuals on their faculty and staff. The president of the CCCU sent out a note to all member presidents, all 120 of us, telling us that we needed to enter into a time of conversation and dialogue about EMU and Goshen's decision. My response to her was, conversation about what? Dialogue about what? I would think that it's a time for conviction and clarity. It's not a time to sit around and have a conversation about something that I think is overtly clear in Scripture. So what is it that you want to talk about? The response that I received firsthand from the president of the CCCU was this: Everett, You know, the CCCU represents many different denominations over a broad theological spectrum. We have disagreements within those denominations, such as methods of baptism, the woman's role at the pulpit, creation time frames, and whether or not you should speak in tongues. And therefore, we're going to have a conversation and dialogue about this issue in like fashion. My response to her was, Dr. So-and-so, you just conflated a volitional sexual act that is prohibited in Scripture with a disagreement over whether or not we should speak in tongues. You will never get me to concede that these are on the same moral plane. Never. This is bad theology, this is bad ontology, and this is bad anthropology in terms of what the human being is. And if we can't get this one straight, that we don't define ourselves by our desires, that our identity is more than the sum total of what we're inclined to do, sexually or otherwise. If we can't get this one straight, that the Bible is clear on sexual moral behavior, and that my behavior is different than who I am and what my being is, and that I have volitional responsibility and culpability, and that I can choose some behaviors and I should eschew other behaviors. If we can't get this one right, then Oklahoma Wesleyan is in the wrong organization. Ultimately, as the conversation dragged on, and I emphasize conversation and dialogue dragged on, I finally said, I need to send a clear message to my constituency that we have conviction and clarity on this issue. We're not going to sit around and talk about it anymore.
And then you mentioned later in the book that in 2010, the Huffington Post, of all people, declared Oklahoma Wesleyan that ranked #1 with the best university professors in the entire nation. I was curious if any of the other schools in the CCCU ranked anywhere in the top 10, 20, 50, et cetera.
You know, I honestly don't remember. I don't know that they did, but I wouldn't go to the wall on that. I'd have to go back and look at those records. But Oklahoma Wesleyan was cited on CBS News Money Watch through ratemyprofessor.com, a website that any student can go to across the nation and rate their respective faculty members, and tens of thousands do. CBS News Money Watch figured out that you could click a mouse and compile the data and figure out what universities did well and which ones didn't. And for 3 consecutive years, Oklahoma Wesleyan was ranked #1 in terms of student review of their faculty, which I think speaks volumes about our paradigm for education.
I've got a neighbor who's a professor. I won't say which school, so we'll go and rate my professor, and if he gets a 3-star review, we'll rib him a little bit. If it's a 1-star, we don't say anything, because that's not nice. So you talked about some of the terms that are being, you know what, actually I want to pause, I want to tell a story. Don Boudreau is a professor of economics at George Mason, someone I've read his blog for many years, and I really admire him. I had him on the show about 6 months ago, and I told a story about my grandfather, who was born in the late 1920s, who grew up through the Depression, basically talks about starving for all of his childhood, retired at 50 years old in the construction business, and lived longer retired than he did working. Flourished, incredibly prosperous and wealthy, was a mountain of a man, in my opinion. And when he was about 85 or 90, when I was old enough to start having these conversations with him, I asked if he had any regrets in life. And he said, I had one. And he didn't even think about it. He said, I sent my kids to college because I never got to go. And then they never came home. And and that's actually the reason I didn't end up going. And as a professor who's mired in it as you are, I asked myself the question, what do we do? And you had a great chapter at the end about what parents can do to prepare their kids. But I mentioned earlier these cultural, iconic monoliths. You've got kids going out there tearing down statues for perceived injustices. But at the same time, you have crumbling, gigantic structures in our culture, the Hollywood, the media, the NFL, academia, that are collapsing under their own weight. And I heard Dennis Prager say that recently, that the problem with progressivism and today's liberalism is that they don't have the structure for personal betterment. And I look at these institutions and say that's really what's missing, especially for someone who tries to live a Christ-centered life. Eventually, immorality will crumble under its own weight. What do we do? What is the future of the university? Can it be saved? And at this point, is it worth saving?
Well, the university is worth saving. I emphasize the word. The university is worth saving, because the university stands for the unity of veritas, the unity of truth, and the comprehensive nature of God's revealed truth upon our heart, which sets us free. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. The diversity should not be saved. I'm president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. I'm not the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan Diversity. It's because we teach unity, we don't teach division. We believe that truth is the bonding glue for a free people and a free culture, and that is the heart and soul of the academy. That's what the ivory tower is supposed to do. However, 9 out of 10 of our institutions today would disagree with everything I just said. And what my advice to parents would be this: stop sending your kids off to these institutions that teach this pablum. Please. Stop dropping $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year on the barrelhead to send your kids off to an institution that boldly tells you they're going to rip his heart, mind, and soul out and mock everything that you've tried to instill in that kid for the first 18 years of your life. And in 18 minutes, as you're driving away from new student orientation, they're already ridiculing your biblical worldview and your conservative values. Why would you pay for that? There are a handful of institutions still in the United States that boldly and unapologetically stand on the revelation of truth rather than a postmodern construct. They believe in those self-evident truths that are endowed to us by our Creator. They believe in the words of Jesus, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." They believe that you get a degree in facts, not feelings. I am going to officiate a commencement this afternoon at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, and you know what? I'm not going to pat them all on the back and say, "Congratulations, you now have a diploma in opinions." I'm not going to celebrate their opinion when they walk across the podium. And you know why? It's because I actually expect them to learn something that's true and right and real. And if all they've got is an opinion after spending 4 years here, I would suggest they wasted their money, because opinions always lead to bondage and slavery. Pol Pot and Mao and Robespierre and Chavez and Mussolini and Hitler all had opinions, and it didn't end well. And again, the theme for today's interview: Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Not your opinion, not your feelings, but the facts, the objective reality of what we find in that measuring rod outside of those things being measured. That's what education should be. And if you're not getting it, stop going there. Go someplace else that provides it.
Doctor, I admire the work that you're doing. I really enjoyed the book. I have one final question. I read an article about 2 weeks ago where someone predicted that the university as we know it would see its demise within 10 years. Now, there weren't a lot of strict definitions about what that means, but I tend to agree with them that based on the financial and moral ROI of the current state of the diversity, it's just not going to survive. And I actually look forward to that day, whereas you're doing work that very much contradicts that. What do you expect is going to happen? What's the future of the academia in general?
I think I read the same article. I forget the author, but he may be right. He may be right that the university as we know it will implode because of the financial situation that it finds itself in. And I hope and pray that there will be those institutions that are faithful and true to the pursuit of truth rather than the propagation of your opinion. I hope those institutions that boldly pursue truth will find donors that will endow their operation to the extent that it doesn't matter what the federal government does, and it doesn't matter what the direction that culture takes, that they will continue to be able to do their good work as we've done for some 1,000 years in educating the next generation of people to be free.
Well, my prayer is that at least one person will have their life altered by your words, and that they'll be touched, and that it'll do some good in the world. Thank you so much, Doctor. I appreciate it, and best of luck to you with the book. Thank you very much.
Blessings to you.